Hi, everybody. I am here to talk to you about all of the exciting questions that you guys give us on federal and Washington leave laws. And this is actually a little bit of a trick because there's more than just state and federal, and we'll just touch on a few of those things as well. Leave is actually very, very broad. I think most people think of it as medical leave or family leave, and admittedly, those things come up the most. By far, we get more questions about that. More people need that type of leave, and so you see that a lot. And so we'll be covering most of those types of questions today, but there is more. There's domestic violence leave, workers' comp leave, as Jen talked about earlier today, short and long-term disability. That one is really interesting because not every company has it, but some do, and you need to make sure you're abiding by the terms of those disability leaves as well. Military leave, that one, in this area in particular, a lot of people do have military leave, and it's not just for you. Is it for a family member as well? Personal leave, of course, for any type of individual leave you may need. Geez, I got to go get my car fixed in the shop, or maybe a sabbatical, something like that. And of course, catch-all other. We've got bereavement leave, which we'll touch on today, jury duty, and lots of other reasons that for whatever reason that employee just doesn't want to come to work and needs some time off. So let's talk about what is the universe of leave laws here. And I really think of this as kind of the layers. So what are the layers of laws that might govern or that you need to address here? And, of course, we've got the federal, we've got the state, city, and county. So you heard Hannah talk a little bit about that earlier in a different context. And of course, Kristen talking about drilling down into the city level as well. I think a lot of people do forget there are county leave laws. And so we need to, keep those in mind depending on where your workforce is, where your company is. And it doesn't stop there. It also includes what the company policies are. And so that can be a policy that you have on your website. It can be a policy that a company has distributed via email. It can be a handbook. And I'm sure some of you are sitting there thinking, what about that handbook? I know there's a provision in the handbook that says, my handbook is not a contract. Doesn't matter if it's a contract. If you have leave agreements in there or policies in there, companies got to abide by those. And then, of course, there are agreements you have with your employees as well. A lot of times that is a hiring agreement. It can be an agreement entered into at some point throughout the course of employment. Those agreements can grant things like vacation time and other types of leave, that sabbatical leave, something that's not otherwise required by law, but that the company and the employee have agreed to allow and give the employee time off for. Got to be thinking about all of those things. Okay, now what laws are we talking about here? And you might think, man, that is a long list. It is. It is a long list, and it's not all. You'll note there's nothing on here about city or counties. These are just kind of the big ticket things you really need to be checking on and thinking about. The first two there, the ADA, FMLA, that's Americans with Disabilities Act, the Family and Medical Leave Act. Those are probably the two biggest that come up a lot. They cover disability medical leave, and of course for FMLA, family leave as well. And hopefully most folks are familiar now with our Washington Paid Family and Medical Leave Law. I might call it WA PFML for short. That allows a lot of leave variety for employees too. Now, of course, there are many other things listed here. I've got a couple that talk about family military leave. There's USERA with also military leave. WA PFML covers military leave. Huge variety. Many of these things address disability leave, family leave. And here is what's tricky. They all apply in different circumstances. You think people would line these things up and make sure that they make sense, have some alignment even in definitions. Not so. So it makes it very difficult for a company to figure out what applies and how do we deal with this. Just as an example, some of the laws apply depending on how many employees the company has. Sometimes that's how many employees in a certain radius. The ADA, okay, we've got to have 15 employees. Oh, well, Washington law against discrimination, that also deals with disability. For that, you only need to have 8 employees for that to apply. FMLA, 50 employees. Some of them, it just doesn't matter. Domestic violence leave, no minimum employee requirement. So it really depends on kind of what what the leave is being requested, how many employees you have to know which of these apply. And back to the definitions. Okay, I should be able to figure out someone has a disability or not. No. Again, ADA has one definition of disability. Washington law against discrimination is much broader. Just because you think you've got it covered in one area, you're cool in another, not the case. Okay, what about different family members that might need leave or protection for family? Family isn't even defined the same in all of these different areas too. Are your parents-in-law covered? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. What about kids after they turn 18? Again, sometimes yes, sometimes no. All of this really goes to say, of course, people have questions about how to handle leave. Why wouldn't you have questions? This is just an incredibly complex area with a lot of different laws that apply. And what's really important about this is that you just drill down and take each leave request as it comes. Of course, it's great if you have some policies in place, like, all right, every time we have a pregnant employee, here's kind of the process we follow. Or if someone has an injury, here's a process we follow. But it is important to an individual consideration at every turn to say, okay, am I missing something? What could possibly apply here? And run through that and see, is the employee entitled to leave? Now, we've talked about, okay, there are a bunch of federal, state, and local laws. What one do I pick? And again, it kind of depends on what the leave request is, but here's your best rule. You're really picking the law that is most beneficial to the employee. That's the bottom line. You don't get to pick and choose and say, oh, well, this is much better for the company, if only it were so, but it's not. It's really what's best for the employee. And so you need to keep that in mind when looking at the different laws that could apply. And of course, as Kristen already talked about, where is that employee working? Gosh, you think you've got a Washington state workforce, but you've got people now in COVID that have gone to work in other places. You've got to look at those leave laws as well. One example, again, vacation leave should be voluntary for employers to provide in Washington. And in Washington, when someone is terminated or leaves the company, you don't have to pay that vacation leave out. Different states have different rules. California, you bet you have to pay that vacation leave. It's different by every state. And so you really do have to think about where is the employee, what law applies, and how is that beneficial. Also, the concurrent or consecutive, it's really easy if, okay, I've got FMLA, WA PFML, hopefully those things are concurrent and I'm good to go. That isn't always 100% true that you can just have concurrent leave. Sometimes there's also consecutive leave. And again, this comes up on a case-by-case basis. But I think this next question really goes to that. So this question is, does a company need to allow additional leave if an employee has exhausted or maybe isn't even eligible for WA PFML or family leave? And here's what happens. Most companies think, great, I have met this obligation. They have, for example, taken 12 weeks of leave for surgery, they should be able to come back. What if they say, oh, shoot, yes, it's been 12 weeks. I'm not quite ready to come back. My doctor says I need 1 more week, maybe 2 more weeks. Can you just automatically say, peace out, goodbye, employee, you're done? I don't think so. I don't think that's the best course for you. And here's why. What if another law applies like the ADA? What if this is, considered a disability? The ADA doesn't have that same number of week limit that FMLA does. Instead, what it does is say, okay, is leave a reasonable accommodation? And in this case, is additional leave a reasonable accommodation? And if it's so, you might have to allow that leave. Now, again, it has to be a reasonable accommodation. And you can say it might not be reasonable, but you have to really prove it's an undue hardship. And gosh, that is a high burden, high threshold to meet. And so when in doubt, really you should be erring on the side of granting that additional week or so. Doesn't mean leave can go on forever. It shouldn't go on forever. I wish I could say, oh, here's the magic number. If it's X weeks, X month, you're good to go. There just isn't that magic number. You really do have to consider the circumstances, the job, the employee to know whether or not additional leave would be appropriate. And sometimes it really is. So keep that in mind. A couple questions on WA PFML leave. So is the employee entitled to reinstatement? You'll see I've got some yeses and I've got some nos. Basically, I think the short answer is yes, if there's also FMLA requirements met. So I've listed those things there. No, if those things are not met. Do you have fewer employees? Has the company or has the employee not worked the requisite hours for that particular company? If that's the case, then you do not have to have job reinstatement. Doesn't mean you should fire someone straight away. That's in fact not what I would recommend doing. You'll want to warn people that, there's no guarantee of job reinstatement, but you really, again, have to consider the appropriate circumstances. What makes sense for this employee? Should we keep this job open? Okay, what if they just want, 2 weeks off? Does it really make sense to terminate a good employee with only, 2 weeks to go? I don't think you want to be filling that job within those 2 weeks. And so I do want you to be thinking about what makes sense here and how do we handle those types of situations. So this is just for your kind of benefit of, all right, what can we do? It's not always what should we do. I think it's good to remember that leave laws are really minimum requirements. It's what you have to do, what employers are required to do, but they can, and a lot of times do, be more generous to employees. And that's perfectly appropriate. So just keep that in mind. Okay, what about employee benefits? Well, again, this is tied to FMLA. Keep those employee benefits if there's a day of overlap with FMLA. So I think the general rule is if the FMLA requirements fit, yes, you're going to want to be keeping those employee benefits. Now you'll see the next bullet point there says you may keep the benefits if a company elects to do so, even if there's no overlap with FMLA leave. I would say this is the most common. I think that most companies often elect to keep the benefits, and there really are a lot of different reasons for that. Some are just, we just want to be a good company. We like our employees, want to keep them happy. Yes, we're happy to keep them on and keep their benefits. Other times it's an administrative hassle, right? Okay, do I terminate, go through that whole process? What if someone's only out like 2 weeks and then start it all over again? When does their month end? Oh, too much of a headache. Let's just leave people on. Here's the thing. You want to be consistent. So whatever your company is doing, come up with a system, an approach that you apply universally. That's really what you want. Be able to justify it on a business reason. Because in this circumstance, and really with all of these types of leave laws, what you don't want is anyone to claim any sort of discrimination or retaliation based on someone requesting leave. And so if you keep things, similar in similar circumstances, that's really going to help you defend those potential claims that could arise. What about the paying for premiums? You typically employees pay, a portion, and if they don't, great, then they don't have to worry about it. But if employees are paying a portion of their benefit premiums, then yes, you can require employees to continue paying that while on leave. Bereavement leave. All right, this one's kind of a trick. I don't know how many people ask about this that often, but I think it's helpful for everyone to know that there's a change in the law. And this was effective earlier this summer. And it really applies to if someone is on birth or family leave following the birth of a child, for example, and that child passes away. What it does is gives bereavement leave basically for 7 calendar days after that death. And it was a compassion law, really to fix what was in the law of, okay, someone was on WA PFML leave, caring for a newborn child. And then really that leave would have ended if the child passed away and they had to immediately return to work. They wanted to give a grace period there. So just be aware of that in case that does come up. But beyond that, of course, a lot of policies, a lot of handbooks do talk about bereavement leave. And if you've got that, you do need to be abiding by that as well. Pregnancy, so many laws. We could go on about this for a very long time, but I'm just going to give you some highlights here. And I think this is the most important one. And I hope that most people are up on this, but we still get a lot of questions on it. So you'll see, we've laid out kind of what, first of all, different laws that could apply, but beyond that, how long can someone be on leave related to pregnancy? And what you really want to think about is if the WA PFML is applying, they can have up to 18 weeks. So basically 12 medical, 12 bonding, combined gets you to 16. But if there's an incapacitating health issue, that time goes up to 18. I think some people just keep that 12 weeks in their mind from FMLA, and it's really important to know that under WA PFML, it really can be longer. Also, another recent change in the law from this summer, postnatal leave for the parent who gave birth for the next the 6 weeks is now presumptively disability leave there, and you do not have to provide documentation for that. A couple other tips about pregnant employees and, kind of job protection, but I'm just going to point you here to Washington's L&I website. This has a chart that talks about parental leave, pregnancy leave. It's very beneficial. I think it's good to brush up on that whenever you want to look at, okay, what leave, how long, et cetera. I think that's a good spot to go to just kind of as a starting point. Of course, we always help with more in-depth questions and walking through it, but good resource to have. So keep that in mind. Intermittent leave, this really does come up, and I would say in general, yes. Can employees take intermittent leave? Usually, yes. It varies by the law, but I would say your default is, okay, they're probably going to be entitled to intermittent leave. So how should I handle that? It can be in single blocks of time or even on reduced schedule, but this is not something you can automatically deny. So please do keep that in mind. Documentation. I just gave you one example where you don't get to require documentation anymore, and that's for that postnatal 6-week leave. But otherwise, generally, yes, you can and often should be getting some sort of medical certification for a leave issue. You need to know how long, when's the anticipated return to work date, and of course, when someone is coming back to work after a leave, are they released to full duty? What can they do? Are there limitations? You need to know all of those things. And so, yes, it's appropriate to get that information. Just a caveat, I want to make sure this one can slip through the cracks sometimes, but under our Washington sick and safe leave, someone who is out for 2 days on sick leave, you can't require the documentation for that. It has to be more than 3 consecutive days for you to require documentation in that regard. I also wanted to mention the medical release. Sometimes employees say, I just want to talk to the doctor directly or get the information straight from the doctor. I need to know, we need lines of communication open. Sure, you can request that the employee give a medical release so that way you can have, a more direct communication with the medical provider. But what you can't do is require it. So just keep that in mind that you aren't necessarily entitled to that. All right, you think you're in the clear. No leave law applies. So I can just say tough stuff. You don't get leave. Not always the case. Slow down. We talked about check your handbook and policies, whether you've got something about a leave of absence. And again, you really want to go back to the, what are we doing for other employees in these circumstances? How should we be treating this employee? And that's really what you should be doing here is you want to make sure you are treating employees generally the same. And I should also say, it's okay to be more generous. So even if your policies, say one thing, you can be a little more generous. And oftentimes you should be a little more generous just in the interest of keeping that workforce. We all talk about hiring and issues now, and you want to make sure you keep your good employees. And sometimes that's a good way to do so.